Thank you very much. I've never been lapidary before, at least that I knew. Well, one small correction to what John said, 10,000 page views from a link is not bad, but I've discovered that you can double, triple, or even quadruple the number of people who go through a link, so long as it contains the word boobies. Because this is the internet, after all. I've never been able to do that with one of John's posts, but maybe he'll be inspired now to offer something. Well, John's introduction is exactly right. My take on education in America, and it's actually both higher education and K-12 education, comes from Herb Stein's famous statement. Some people actually call it Stein's Law, and originally propounded as if something cannot go on forever, it will stop, and frequently compressed, I think even by Herb Stein later on, as if something can't go on forever, it won't. Well, what can't go on forever? If you look at higher education right now, you see a lot of stuff that can't go on forever. But the big thing that can't go on forever is this divergence between what people make when they get out of college and what it costs to go to college. Ever since the 70s, which coincidentally is right about the time the federal government got into the business of subsidizing tuition and other student expenses, we've had a growth in tuition and fees that has been more than double the rate of growth in family incomes. And that means people have made up the difference with debt. That debt being in the form of federally subsidized and guaranteed student loans for the most part. Back before the housing bubble, people would sometimes take out a home equity loan to finance juniors' college, but while that probably still goes on, there's a lot less of it because there's a lot less home equity. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when you graduate from college, you owe a lot of money. And when you graduate from college and you owe a lot of money, you need a job that pays a lot of money to pay it off. And here's the problem. There aren't so many of those jobs. Not as many as there used to be. Youth unemployment is dreadful. The Youth Misery Index, which is some new compilation somebody came up with just today, I think, at least I just found out about it today, combines unemployment rates under 29 and student loan balances, and it's at a record high. And I think that's actually a moderately useful metric. And you see it all the time. In fact, I was on TV a couple of nights ago talking about the book, and when I came out and the sound man was coming over and disconnecting my microphone and everything, he said, "You were telling the story of my life. I owe $110,000 in student loans, and I'm working 70 hours a week to try to get them paid off." Well, yeah, that's a common problem, and that's if you have a job. And people don't really think this through. You know, when I was in law school, I had a friend who was paying his way through law school on student loans, and he borrowed more money than he really needed to, and he just said, "Well, I just think of it as lawyer Rob buying law student Rob a beer." Yeah, sort of. Yeah, law school was cheap back then by comparison to now, and salaries then were lower, but not as much lower as Yale Law School is more expensive. And I see this with my own law students, which is one of the things that sort of got me interested in this problem. You see people graduating with a lot of student loan debt and getting good jobs that pay a lot, and still being strapped. It's easy to graduate with six-figure debt. The highest debt load for a student I have personally known was $400,000, which I stress to add was not accrued at the University of Tennessee College of Law, where I teach, but rather at pricey private undergraduate and graduate institutions attended prior to law school. But you know, when you get out and you owe $400,000, it almost doesn't matter how much you make. And a job that pays a salary, that's a brutal burden. And the Federal Reserve recently did a study of the impact of student debt, and they found that students are putting off marriage, putting off car purchases, putting off home purchases, and all sorts of things that we normally think of as the kind of thing young and middle-aged adults do and that we sort of rely on to drive our economy because they can't afford it. You can't buy a car when you're already making a pretty big freaking car payment in the form of student loan payments. You can't buy a house when you're essentially already carrying a mortgage on your back. Maybe both. You can't get married, as I was about to say, when you can't afford to buy a house or a car. And that's part of the problem. And that is retarding the lives of people. It is retarding the economy and society as a whole. And it's something that can't go on forever. So it won't. And in fact, there are already signs that it's starting to not go on forever. Which is to say, colleges this year in particular are starting to see buyer resistance. People are thinking very hard about whether they really want to spend $50,000, $60,000 a year and up Every time people find out what the tuition is, they're always like, I can't believe how expensive it is compared to last year or 5 years ago when I last paid attention. And they're just not seeing that as a good buy, especially if it's going to be financed by debt. Right now, a lot of colleges are dealing with this sort of with sub rosa price discrimination. That's what financial aid really is. It's just price discrimination. They figure out how much you can possibly afford to pay, and that's the price for you, because I like you. But that's really what's going on. You are seeing some schools actually having their credit rating downgraded by Moody's because Moody's looks at their business model of high tuition and high expenses and doesn't think it's sustainable. You are seeing enrollments drop across the board in lots of schools. And within colleges, you are seeing humanities departments. The New York Times had a piece on this recently. Humanities departments unhappy because they're losing their prestige and they're losing their majors and they're losing their enrollees because people, interestingly, especially women, don't want to major in the humanities because they're concerned about getting a job when they get out. And that has internal ramifications within universities where budgets are set based on how many students take your classes and things like that that are fairly dramatic. So I think it can't go on forever, and I think it won't. So what happens next? Well, there are lots of things people can do. One thing we might see is people just not going to college. I mean, 40% of college graduates wind up in jobs they could have gotten without a college degree. What's the difference between a Starbucks barista and a Starbucks barista who went to college? 100 grand student loan debt. Which barista would you rather be? Well, there's some story about that. I'm not sure I've got it right, but when Donald Trump was in a lot of financial trouble, he walked along and pointed at some homeless guy lying in the gutter and said, see that guy? He's got $500 million more than me, because he was just broke and not in debt. That's pretty much the lesson for some college graduates. And, you know, in today's world, while getting ahead is probably harder than it's ever been, just getting by is probably easier than it's ever been. Between video games, internet porn, and hookup culture, who needs college? You can have a pretty nice life. Many of the things, in fact, that people used to think they had to exert themselves and make a life for themselves in order to enjoy are now available much more easily. And I'll leave it at that. So one thing you may see is just exit. And in fact, there is some evidence that men in particular are less likely to go to college now because they don't see it as sufficiently rewarding. But I'll leave that to the experts who write on that subject. Another possibility is cheaper alternatives, and we're seeing growth in some of that already too. One of them is online education, and there's a lot of that going on. And it is now no longer just the domain of the University of Phoenix and a few other for-profit schools. Georgia Tech is offering a master's in computer science online that is, as its provost says, a full-service degree, not just sort of an extension program. It's every bit as good as their regular master's, except it's super cheap, kind of appealing. Another thing we're seeing that I would like to see more of, and I think we will, is certification in place of diplomas. Now, I'm not as optimistic the right word, I'm not as convinced as an article that was in the Harvard Business Review today, which says it's the end of degrees, that people are just going to get certificates that show employers that they know how to do useful things instead of diplomas, which apparently no longer do that. But I do think that certificates of actual ability are a big deal, and the people who think that too are colleges, because the higher education establishment itself is getting behind third-party certification as a way of demonstrating to people that their degrees mean something, and I think that's pretty useful. Another thing that's starting to happen is the rise of apprenticeship models, and there was a really, I thought it was sort of a sad article in the Washington Post. It was about people who had gone to college and couldn't get jobs, going back to trade schools to learn how to be electricians and plumbers and things like that. Now, there's nothing sad about being an electrician or a plumber. In fact, I remember I was talking to one of my fellow law professors a few years ago about one of Michael Lynn's articles about the exploitation of the working class, and his response was, yeah, I might find that persuasive if I hadn't seen my electrician's house. And being an electrician is good work, and there's no reason why a smart person can't be an electrician. The story said that the sad thing for these people was they'd gone to college and run up all the debt before deciding to become plumbers or electricians. They would have been much better off if they just skipped the college stage entirely. But according to the article, guidance counselors in high school don't want to tell smart people to pursue a trade. They steer them to college. Well, smart people make better electricians. So I don't know,